Beautiful morning out there today. I wonder what I should get up to. Check the temperature. That is not good. Minus 34 degrees. I think I'm staying inside today. Today would be an excellent day to do some trip planning instead. Hey, before we get to that, I've got one quick little short fun activity for weather just like this. Just the other night, I was fortunate to attend the local stop of the Banff Mountain Film Festival. They do a world tour every year, and I saw an amazing film about a mother and daughter team who did a winter ski traverse of the Pacific Coast Mountains. They skied from Vancouver, British Columbia to Skagway, Alaska. The movie was called The Mountain Coast Range Traverse Segment. I'll put some info to that below if you're interested in the movie. But these gals certainly knew a thing or two about trip planning. Their trip took 6 months and covered 2,300 kilometers, but they weren't hiking. They were doing a winter ski traverse and crossing mountains, rivers, and ice fields. They traveled in super remote location in very cold weather and relied on food and fuel to be dropped from airplanes. Every 4 or 5 days or so, they would use a locator beacon to find their food supply cache that was dropped. A trip like that takes a tremendous amount of planning, knowing your food needs and your fuel needs, planning your route where there actually is no trail. It's just an incredible achievement. Spoiler alert, I'm not going to tell you how to plan for a trip like that. That's beyond my experience level, but I do a lot of backcountry trips, and I often get asked in the comments how someone new can take on such a thing. I'm going to lay out some principles and tips aimed at helping you become a better backcountry trip planner. But you know what? These techniques are scalable. If you can do a 2 or 3 night trip, you can certainly take on a week or 2 week trip, and if you can do that, you can eventually get yourself up to a month or longer. No problem. If I was going to sum up backcountry travel in one word, I think that word would be commitment. You probably expect me to talk about gear lists and meal planning, and I'm going to get to that kind of stuff. But the number one issue on any backcountry trip is commitment. I like to think the backcountry begins where you stop seeing day hikers and where the portages become too long for most people to deal with. So by definition, backcountry trips are remote, so help may not be able to get to you quickly. The remoteness increases your risk and forces you to be more aware and accountable for your preparations and actions. So considering the inherent lack of support in the backcountry, it's important to plan carefully. When you start planning a backcountry trip, you're making a commitment to yourself and any travel companions you have. You must commit to planning carefully in an effort to reduce risks. So backcountry trips can often be physically challenging, and they often involve what's sometimes referred to as Type 2 fun. If you're not familiar with this concept, I'll bring you up to speed. Type 1 fun is when you're doing an activity and the activity itself is fun, and you also remember it later on as being fun. Type 2 fun is a little bit different. It's when you're doing the activity and you're not having fun doing that activity at all, but in later years you think back on that experience and say, yeah, that was an awful lot of fun. So a good example of that might be hiking up a mountain in the rain with some buddies. You might have not had a good time at all while you were doing that, but as you look back on that experience later in life, you think to yourself, boy, that was a lot of fun. Type 3 fun, well, that's not fun at all. That's when you don't have fun doing the activity and you remember it as not being fun. So not everyone enjoys Type 2 fun, and so a challenging backcountry experience isn't for everyone. Everything in life is about trade-offs, and by choosing to go on a backcountry trip, you're going to be missing out on some other experiences. And if you're the type of person who prefers those other experiences, maybe you shouldn't go on a backcountry trip. It's really important to understand what you're getting into before you commit. So after commitment, I think the next most important thing to talk about is goals and objectives. what do you want to get out of your trip? And more importantly, if you're going with somebody else, does everyone else want to get out of the trip? Your travel companion may be someone you know well and have been out with before, and if so, you're probably on the same page about trip expectations, but if not, you really should go through a couple of things. I really recommend having a discussion about what everybody wants from the trip. Let's say you're going on a canoe trip and one person in the group expects to go fishing every day. If everybody else in the trip wants to travel, you're going to have some conflicts. Staying in one place fishing is incompatible with those other objectives. Same thing with trip difficulty. Do you expect to be pushing yourself and covering miles, or is it a more leisurely, relaxed trip? You want to make sure everyone in the group is on the same page about expectations. Have a discussion about skills. Know where everyone is in terms of simple navigation, fire making, first aid, all that kind of stuff. That can be important. Not to say that everyone on the trip needs those skills, but you need to know you have them amongst the group and adjust accordingly. So I've taken my kids on a long backcountry canoe trip, and my kids certainly didn't have those skills, but we accommodated that by having shorter travel days and making sure we had enough time in camp every day so that my wife and I could do all the things that needed to be done so that we were comfortable. Probably one of the most challenging backcountry scenarios in terms of teamwork is when you have a large group of people all on the same trip who have diverging interests, different levels of skill and knowledge about the backcountry. As soon as that group encounters some difficulty or challenge, you're going to see some fractures in the group. The group will split probably, and you're going to see some folks banding together and perhaps taking more risks than they should. Others may be more cautious, and that's the beginning of accidents happening. So I really wouldn't want to be part of a trip like that. It could be risky and challenging and not a lot of fun at all. If you're thinking about doing something like that, I think you should really get the group together and do some pre-trip exercises to make sure people understand what each other's interests and skill sets are. And the last thing to consider, I think, in terms of goals and objectives is, are your tripping companions as committed as you are? Quite honestly, I've seen it many, many times. It hasn't happened to me very much. I often see this where people bail on companions just before a trip. I was once doing a backpacking trip along Lake Superior, and we encountered a bunch of sea kayakers, and there was like 6 in the group, and I said, oh, that's a big group. And they said, well, it was supposed to be 10 of us. 4 people bailed at the last minute. So a strategy for this is that everyone, if you're going to do a trip like that, everyone should be self-contained. Everyone has their own stove, their cook pots, their food, their tarps and shelter, whatever. There's great economies to be had by sharing group gear, but if you suspect people are going to bail, everybody should be self-contained. So I like to use the term locking in when I'm planning a trip. When I'm discussing a trip with someone, until we decide to go, I like to keep the concept open and flowing with no pressure. If someone is truly interested in going with you, they're going to let you know and they're going to book their trip. If you've been talking about a trip with someone for a while and you haven't locked in, no worries. Just remember that they likely have other competing interests and priorities, and that's okay. Just make an adjustment. So it's great to talk about trips in concept with people, but when you finally make your decision, choose where you're going to go and lock in solid. So by locking in, I'm getting back to that commitment piece. There's a number of things you can do to truly lock in on a trip. If you need to book off work, do that early. Block your calendar off. Lots of things are going to come up the week before, but if you've had that calendar spot reserved for several months, you are going to lock in and you're going to actually go on that trip. Certainly make your reservations as early as possible, and I think my biggest tip is to tell your family and friends that you are going on a trip. It's harder to back out from your companions and yourself if you've told folks that you are going on this trip. This day and age, we're all very busy, and it's more important than ever to guard against those other priorities that you have in your life. If you really want to go on a backcountry trip, you want to block off that time, secure it as much as possible. It's really important to lock in, to guard against those other things that will prevent you from actually going on a backcountry trip. And I recommend locking in as early as possible. Do your planning in January and February. Most successful warm weather trippers are all done their planning by March. They're locked in and all the planning is done. So the big question on most trips is, where are you going to go? I've got one little bit of advice for you on this. Do not consider budget or time constraints when you start thinking about where to go. Think about where you really, really want to go. Think about those places that you dream about, and you kind of know you're not going to get there because of finances or time, but allow yourself to dream big and then do your research. You might find seat sales or certain advantages that allow you to do something that you thought was out of your reach. As an example, I've sometimes seen flights that required me to fly through Toronto to another destination, such as Boston or New York, and for whatever reason, even though I'm flying to Toronto and then on to another destination, that flight is actually cheaper than if I just flew to Toronto. You never know what you're going to find when you do searches online for ticket prices. You might be surprised. So when I'm scoping out potential backcountry trip destinations that involve considerable travel just to get to that location, I do a lot of detailed research online. I investigate the cost of air travel, any rental vehicles I might need, what's the cost of driving in terms of time. Is a shuttle required to get me from one end of the trail to another? You can go online and find all kinds of information about this stuff this day and age, and you can develop a specific budget for a potential trip. Another thing to think about is, do you need staging accommodations? That's when you need a hotel room before or after your trip, or both. And you should build that into your cost, as well as any permits or reservations that you might need. So you and your travel companions have committed to a trip. You've had a good discussion about objectives and goals, and you've picked a spot to go. The next thing to do is to get into some detailed planning about that specific trip. I really like guidebooks. I've got a whole bunch of them, and I've never regretted purchasing a guidebook, even if I didn't go on the trip. Here's a good example of a book that's for a whole area. It's the Guide to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a hiking guidebook. This one's very similar in concept. It's the Canadian Rockies Trail Guide. It's got all of the famous and not so famous trails of the Canadian Rockies. Here's one that's a little more specific and local to me, the Guide to the Superior Hiking Trail. Gives you all the information you need and maps about that trail. Another similar one, Isle Royale National Park. Again, all kinds of information about canoeing or hiking in the park. So here's another sort of style of book. This is Quetico and Beyond by Kevin Callan. It shows canoe routes scattered throughout Ontario. Not all of them, but some of the better ones. And it's another style of backcountry guide and provides a lot of good information. And if you're going to be doing a backcountry trip, you're going to require some maps. First off, I've got some maps that are of a very broad scale, meaning they cover a large area. This one's of the Black Hills National Forest. This is of Woodland Caribou Provincial Park. You could probably navigate with these maps, but they're better for trip planning, figuring out how you're going to get to an access point, and planning your overall route. When you start looking for maps for navigation, you're going to want to find a map that covers a smaller area. This is a good example of one of those. This is a national topographic map from Canada. These cover the entire country, and most of them are at the 1 to 50,000 scale, which is really good for local navigation. Sometimes a specific area will make a series of navigational maps. These are for the Superior Hiking Trail, and the maps look like this. They fit in your pocket, and they're at a scale suitable for navigation. So by looking at and studying guidebooks and maps, you should be able to get a good sense of the details of where you want to go, the challenge of those trails or water bodies that you're going to be traveling on. Another great source of information is blogs and videos that you might find online, or discussion groups. Chances are someone else has done this trip you're thinking of doing, and they've probably made a video or written about it, and it's another great source of information to help you in your detailed planning. As you do your detailed planning, you're really going to want to understand if a permit is required and how you go about getting that permit. Some places it's first come, first serve. Some places it's a reservation, and some places, like in the States, where some of the trails are very competitive, it's actually a lottery system, and sometimes it's a blend of all those things. So you really want to understand that. You also want to understand, are you getting a permit to use the trail and camp anywhere, or do you have to camp at certain specific locations? When I book backpacking trips in the Canadian Rockies and in our national parks, it's usually you're usually booking the specific campsite for each night. You're also going to want to understand if there's any restrictions on having an open fire. Rules around that seem to differ widely. Often in the mountains, when you get to a certain elevation, and if it's a busy enough trail, the rule is no fire anywhere, because there's just not enough resources to support having frequent fires. When I'm doing a canoe trip in the boreal forest, there's tons of firewood, and it's usually not a problem unless there's some sort of restricted fire ban because of the fire weather index. So wherever you go, you're also going to want to understand if there's any restrictions on food storage. Some places, especially the western U.S., in national parks and similar areas to that, require a bare canister. Bare canisters are great, but they're heavy, and there are alternative lighter methods that are sometimes accepted elsewhere. So as you get into your detailed planning, you're going to want to actually draw a route on your map and figure that route out. You're going to want to look for serious gains in elevation, areas that might be challenging, areas that might be rough. You're going to try and develop an estimate for how far you can travel each day and figure out where you're going to stay and camp each night. So you're going to want to look at that map and understand where your sources of water are, and if there's any parts of the map where water is going to become rare. When I'm planning a trip route, I often look for shortcuts to get out of the backcountry if there's an emergency, escape routes if you want to call them that. If something happens in the backcountry and you need to get out quickly, is there an alternative route? Or is there a ranger station or some kind of outpost camp that might have communication or first aid equipment should I get myself into some kind of jam? So let's talk about gear and checklists. So my gear needs always vary a little bit from trip to trip, and they certainly change with the season. So it's important to review your gear needs and, if possible, review them early before you get close to going on that trip. And I make a checklist for every trip. So when I develop a checklist, I try and cluster my items into categories. I try and come up with categories that I think are kind of natural, and for me at least, for thinking about gear and gear systems. That way I think about the category, and it's fairly easy for me to think about all the items in that category that I need to bring along. So a good example would be my sleeping system. It's got my mattress, my pillow. I might want to have my quilt or a sleeping bag and a sleeping bag liner. Some of the categories I often use are things like shelter, sleeping, food, kitchen equipment, that kind of stuff. I find those are good categories for me to plan around. So when you've made your checklist, it's important to go through all your equipment and shake it down before a trip. Make sure everything is still functional and usable on your trip. If you need to replace gear or fix something or sharpen something, you don't want to be doing it the night before your trip. You're going to have other things you've forgotten and you need to deal with at the last minute. So try and take care of everything you can well in advance. If you're going in a group and you've decided to have group gear, you certainly want to make sure you know who's responsible for bringing what piece of group gear, especially things like the first aid kit. You don't want to be out there and discover that no one realized they were supposed to bring the first aid kit. So when you've got the details of your trip planned out and the gear you're going to bring, you're going to want to write everything down. Maybe not everything, but you should be able to write a nice, clear, concise trip itinerary. This is pretty important. So I was taught the importance of having a good trip itinerary by a friend and fellow YouTuber whose channel name is Winter Trekker. Hoop, as he's known, does a lot of long solo canoe tripping, sometimes in the high Arctic or the boreal forest. So a really good trip itinerary should describe you quite well. It should describe your experience in the backcountry. It should describe what you're wearing, color and brand name of clothing, and the major gear that you're bringing with you, your pack, your tent, your tarp, your canoe, that kind of thing. The itinerary should describe the nature of any communications that you have with you, a cell phone or a personal locator beacon or a spot device, that kind of thing. The itinerary should also describe your intended route and if there's any optional ways out of the backcountry that you might consider using if you run into trouble. The itinerary should also describe if you brought any extra food to help you last if your trip goes longer. And probably the most important thing a trip itinerary should describe is your expectations around being late. At what point should someone that you left this with give this to the authorities and request that they start doing a search for you? A really big component of trip planning is meal planning. You want to think through the meals and food you're going to bring along for your trip. I find that when it comes to meal planning, there's kind of two camps of people out there. Maybe more, but I find there's a group of folks out there who are probably experienced and they're really interested in bringing the right amount of calories per day for their needs. That's great. If you want to plan like that's fine. There's resources online to help you figure out how much calories is in a meal, and you can plan that way. But I find that most folks actually simply bring too much, especially beginners. They'll just They'll just plan to bring too much. They think they're going to be more hungry when they're on a trip, and they will be, but they overcompensate for that. I've seen food dumped on trips before. It's nothing worse than getting to a campsite and finding someone's thrown all their rice in the lake because they didn't want to carry it anymore. So a tip I have for you is to weigh your food before and after every trip. That way, over time, you'll develop a really good understanding of how much food you want to bring on a trip. I dehydrate most of my meals when I'm backcountry camping, and I've figured out a little formula that 150 grams of dehydrated food, almost no matter what it is appropriate size of meal for me in the backcountry. I know through experience that 150 grams of food will rehydrate to about 2 cups of volume after I add water, and that's perfect for a man who's been working in the backcountry all day, paddling or hiking. 2 cups of food for supper is just about right. So if you really want to cut down on your weight and bulk of a trip, go on shorter trips and weigh your food before and after and adjust accordingly every time you go out again. After very few trips, you're going to have a system dialed down very well. So not everyone does this, but I think it's really important to plan for contingencies on a trip. By that I mean anything that might interrupt your trip, either you from going or your progress along the way. So it might be along a trip and your path might be blocked by something. What options do you have to get out? Or it could be your whole trip, for instance, is blocked. We've been trying to do a particular trail in the Rockies for 2 years in a row, and both last year and the year before, we weren't able to go because of the forest fires in the area. So on both those situations, we planned complete alternate trips. I actually booked them in advance because I was watching the conditions, and I thought, you know what, I better book 2 trips, and I can cancel one at the last minute if necessary. So it's really important to understand the current conditions of where you're going before you get there. If you're going to a regulated area like a park or a national forest, pick up the phone, give them a call, and ask them what the conditions are. They'll be more than happy to assist you and walk you through any developments that are occurring. And if you're traveling anywhere to go on a backcountry trip, I have 2 more pieces of advice to think about. That is to ensure you have the appropriate travel insurance for where you're going. I'm Canadian, and I don't mind traveling around here, but as soon as I go to the States, I buy travel insurance. Absolutely. Don't want to get caught across the border without insurance. And my last piece of advice, and I often forget this, is to call your credit card company if you're going to be doing some traveling. So if you're going to travel to a destination to do a backcountry trip, and you're going to have some unusual expenses, I forget this all the time, but call your credit card company and let them know there may be some unexpected charges in a different jurisdiction. All right, that was a fairly long list of advice. I hope you got something out of it. The last little bit of advice I have is to go out and have fun. You're doing all this prep work for a purpose, and so go out and have some fun in the backcountry. All right, thanks for watching, guys.